Esteemed scholars, colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Center for Islamic Shi'a Studies, second lecture in its series on Shia narratives of the formative Muslim period. Tonight's guest came to France a few decades ago in order to complete his studies in Islamology on the advice of none other than the great Henri Corbin, whose chair he now occupies at the prestigious École Pratique des Hautes Études at the Sorbonne. His works are some of the most remarkable and groundbreaking contributions to the field of Shia studies. He is the divine guide in early Shi'ism, his spirituality in Shia Islam, his edition of al-Sayyārí's Kitāb al-Qirā'āt in collaboration with Etienne Kohlberg, his Dictionnaire du Coran, and finally his latest book on early Shia literature are inevitable references for any serious and rigorous study of Shi'ism. The Center for Islamic Shi'a Studies is honored to welcome Professor Mohammad Ali Amir-Moezzi, who most graciously accepted its invitation to deliver tonight's lecture on the notions of the speaking Quran and the silent Quran. Those of you who have the rather dubious privilege of knowing me will understand why also I wish to thank the Center for Islamic Shi'a Studies for giving me the great honor of chairing the lecture of someone whose work has been so important for my own research.
Thank you very much. First of all, I would like to thank the Center for Islamic Shi'a Studies for its invitation, and especially my friends Ahab Badawi and Francisco José Luis, and more especially Francisco José Luis for his excellent English translation of my original French text. And I would like to apologize for my bad English and for my bad accent. The title of my lecture is The Silent Quran and the Speaking Quran, History and Scriptures through the Study of Some Ancient Texts. 1. Addressing the issues, violences and scriptures in early Islam. During the last 2 decades, within the framework of my courses at the Sorbonne, I have dedicated many years to the study of some ancient Shia works, their historical and religious context, their authors, their structure and content, the intellectual and spiritual movements in which they came into being, etc. Delving into the history of this text has led me progressively to a series of issues that, despite their obviousness, had not been sufficiently studied. The connection between the development of Islam's scriptural sources, namely the Quran and the Hadith, and the fratricidal violence and civil wars that have marked the first centuries of that same religion. 2 major facts, indissolubly related, that determined the historical and spiritual evolutions of Islam even to this very day. As far as scriptural sources are concerned, it all occurred quite straightforwardly according to Sunni tradition that came to be known as the Orthodox one. The divine revelations gathered faithfully and in their entirety by the 2 first caliphs, Abu Bakr and Umar, were collected in a single Quran by a commission of scholars during the rule of the 3rd caliph, Uthman, that is less than 30 years after the death of the Prophet Muhammad. Parallel Quranic versions, deemed unworthy to be trusted, were destroyed, and the official version, called the Uthmanic Codex, was soon accepted by the entire community of the faithful, except for a handful of heretics. Similarly, regarding the Hadith, that is the prophetic traditions of which there were thousands, they were subjected to severe examination by scholars in order to identify the authentic from the fake ones. This ended up in the development of a vast, reliable corpus established according to the strict rules of the criteriological science of Hadith. And yet, critical research, by submitting both Islamic and non-Islamic sources of all sorts to thorough historical and philological examination for the last 150 years, offers a far more complex and more problematic picture of the history of the composition of Islam's holy writings. An important corpus of sayings by Muhammad seems to have been progressively distinguished in Quran and Hadith that is identified respectively as God's words and prophetic traditions. The official Quran, put a posteriori under the patronage of Uthman, seems to have been established later, probably under the caliphate of the Umayyad Abdul Malik ibn Marwan, 65 to 86 of Hijrah, 85 to 705. It also presents all the signs of a long work of composition at the hands of a team of scribes and other established scholars. Only a few decades separate the eras of both caliphs, but those decades amount to many centuries, given that between both periods, the incalculable consequences of both incessant civil wars and the huge and lightning conquests have disrupted the history, society, and mentalities of the first Muslims. In addition, even when drawn up and declared official, the state codex took many centuries in order to be accepted by all Muslims. Among the scholars and movements opposed to the Umayyad state, a great number of important personalities seems not to have accepted the authenticity of the Osmanic Quran and considered it to be a tempered version of the revelations that were made to the Prophet. Among them, the Shia expressed the most systematic and most numerous criticism against the integrity of the official Quran. Other Quranic versions, sometimes very different in both form and content, like the ones of Ali, the cousin and son-in-law of the Prophet and fourth Caliph, or the companions Abdullah ibn Mas'ud and Ubay ibn Ka'b, continued to circulate at least until the 4th, 10th century. Likewise, unending discussions regarding the authenticity of hadith opposed scholars often for centuries, and even when between the 4th and 5th centuries of Hijrah, the Sunnis agreed more or less to accept the corpus of what they call the sums of authentic traditions. The Shia constitute their own corpus where the very definition of the term hadith differed from that of the Sunnis. For the latter, the hadith is the whole of the tradition going back to the Prophet and in some rare cases to some of his companions, whereas for the Shia the terms refer to the tradition going back to the Prophet, his daughter Fatima, Ali and the Imams descending from the latter. As for the endemic violence in which Islam was born and developed, it is enough to recall some over-recognized historical facts. Right after Hijrah, the last years in the life of the Prophet were sprinkled with many battles. Among them, the Battle of Badr in the year 2 of Hijrah, 624, the first great victory for the latter over the Meccan opponents from his own tribe, the Quraysh, seems to have left marks they were not ready to forget even after their conversion to Islam. After the death of Muhammad, according to certain very traditions, he had been poisoned. His succession unleashed a wave of violence to which I will come back later on. Under the first Caliph Abu Bakr, the bloody wars of apostasy, Ridda, took place, through which he prevented the newly converted Arabs to go back to their ancestral religion after the death of the Messenger of Allah. According to the majority of the narratives, Abu Bakr died a natural death. According to others, he was killed by poison. The period of the second Caliph, Umar ibn al-Khattab, was that of the wars of the great Arab conquests. He was himself also killed, apparently by a Persian slave. The third Caliph, Uthman ibn Affan, was swept by what is conventionally called the first great civil war between Muslims. The short reign of the fourth Caliph, Ali ibn Abi Talib, was an uninterrupted series of civil wars. The great battle of Siffin opposed him to Muawiyah, the head of the powerful Umayyad, his old enemies. That battle followed that of the Camel against Aisha, widow of the Prophet, allied to two companions of the latter, and itself preceded the battle of Nahrawan against his former partisans who became his fiercest enemies, the Kharijites. In the end, Ali was assassinated by one of them. The rule of the Umayyad was a long series of abominable repressions and massacres against their opponents, the Alids, the people of Ali in particular, who end up being called the Shia. The infernal cycle of bloody repressions and of armed rebellions had thus started to last for a very long time. The most significant massacre was that of al-Hussein, the beloved grandson of the Prophet and son of Ali, and of almost all his family on the orders of the second Umayyad Caliph, Yazid I, only a few decades after the demise of the Prophet. The Umayyads themselves will later on be themselves overthrown by an armed revolution, that of the Abbasids. Under the caliphate of the latter, the violent repression against their opponents, especially the Alids, of all persuasions once again went on an end of several centuries. The establishment of a new religion accompanied by violence, notably during the complex process of its institutionalization or of its imposition on people that profess other beliefs, is of course not peculiar to Islam. The examples of Judaism and Christianity are too well known to be retold. Nevertheless, what seems to be specific to Islam is first of all the very nature of the violence, namely the fratricide wars that have brought about the deaths of a considerable number of important historical figures, and then the multi-secular longevity of bloody conflicts that oppose the latter against each other. Different constituents of the subject, the relation between the historical conflicts of early Islam and the development of its scriptural sources have been studied on many occasions, from Frédéric Chevalier to Alfred Louis de Prémard, including Ignace Goldziher, Leone Caetani, Regis Blacher, John Wansbrough, Hisham Jait, Claude Gilliot, Harald Notsky, and others. Yet almost all of these numerous investigations that have been going for the last 150 years are almost exclusively based on Sunni sources. Shi'ism, its ancient sources and its representations of Islam's history, studied only for a few decades by a limited number of scientific researchers, are far less explored and remain still insufficiently known. As for the author of these lines, he modestly tries to fill that gap by adopting a new angle of approach to these issues. That is, by examining some ancient Shia works of great importance that have, however, remained neglected. Two, the text studies. 2.1. The Kitāb Sulaym ibn Qays, or the Kitāb al-Saqifa. Let's proceed by chronological order. Our first text is the book of Sulaym ibn Qays, also called the book of Saqifa, named after the place where Abu Bakr was elected to succeed the Prophet. According to Shia tradition, this book is the work of Sulaym ibn Qays al-Hilālī, a disciple of the first Imam Ali. It is mainly dedicated to the Shia perception of the events that have marked the death and succession of the Prophet Muhammad, namely the plot, skillfully instigated by certain companions of the latter, first among them Umar ibn al-Khattab, in order to grab power by placing Abu Bakr on the seat of the caliphate and by removing Ali from what belonged to him by divine right, through the will of God and his messenger. This plot thus inaugurates the corruption and violence of the new religion and the majority of its followers. What can we know of Sulaym and work that carries his name? The reports about him in prosopographical and bibliographical Shia works, as well as in certain critical studies, are quite numerous. Sulaym ibn Qays Abu Sadr al-Hilālī al-Amiri al-Kufi seems to have been one of the fervent followers of Ali. According to traditional narratives, he had started from his early youth to record the events and dramatic conflicts that followed the death of the Prophet and that marked the history of the first caliphates, by basing himself on the narrations he collected from Ali and some of his main partisans and disciples such as Salman al-Farisi, Abu Dharr al-Ghifari, al-Miqdad ibn Aswad, or other protagonists of the events. After the assassination of Ali and the setting up of the Umayyads, violent policy of anti-Ali repression, Sulaym was tracked by the cruel governor of Iraq, al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, who had in mind to kill him. He escaped from Iraq and found refuge in southern Iran in the small village of Naubandagan, Naubandajan in Arabic pronunciation, having of course taken his precious book with him, a written testimony of what he considered to be the biggest treason against the Prophet and his family, narrated directly by some of the protagonists themselves. In his old age, fearing the permanent loss of his manuscript, he found a trustworthy legatee in the person of the traditionist Aban ibn Abi Ayyash. Shortly after, Sulaym passed away and was buried in Naubandagan around the year 76 of Hijrah. The pseudo-epigraphical nature of the Kitāb Sulaym Qays is obvious. The presence within it of data dating sometimes many centuries after the presumed author's period, notably the many passages about the Abbasid revolution or the number of the 12 imams, do not leave any doubts to the history regarding this issue. It is, however, undeniable that successive copies extending up until after the period of the historical imams at the beginning of the 4th century develop around a very ancient early core. Hussein Modarrisi considers that original core to be the most ancient Shia, even Islamic writing to have reached us, and the arguments he brings forward based on a detailed intertextual examination seem very relevant. According to him, the original text of the Book of Sulaym may have been by Husseini proto-Shia of Kufa during the first years of the reign of the Umayyad Hisham ibn Abd al-Malik Caliphate from 105 to 125. What is interesting to underline is that the authors of the ulterior additions did not deem it necessary to remove this original core, whose level nevertheless sometimes conflicts with these additions. To put it briefly, the Book of Sulaym is the account of a conspiracy prepared long before the Prophet's demise, aiming at eliminating the latter and the members of his close family, the nature of his religion, in order to grab power and seize control over the Muslims. The main protagonists of this diabolical conspiracy were Umar, Abu Bakr, and their accomplice Abu Ubaidah ibn al-Jarrah. These plotters were surrounded and supported by the old enemies of the Prophet, who had been crushed at Badr and had freshly and opportunely converted to the new religion, namely the powerful clans of Quraysh, notably the Banu Abd Shams, comprising the Banu Umayyah. They managed to remove Ali, the sole legitimate successor to the Prophet, as well as the other eminent members of the Prophet's family, from power with great violence, and to set up a mighty apparatus of repression and propaganda with the help of governors, military leaders, as well as men of letters, judges, or Jewish theologians. Thus, the Book of Sulaym, depicting the opinions of a powerful Alid movement, maintains that the official Islam of the majority, imposed violently by the enemies of Muhammad Ali, is a profoundly deformed version of the Muhammadan religion. 2.2. The Kitāb al-Qirā'āt, or al-Tanzil wa-Tahrif of al-Sayyārī. The second book examined here is the Book of Quranic recitations, or the Book of Revelation and Falsification of al-Sayyārī, a traditionalist about whom very little is known. His complete name is Abu Abdullah Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Sayyārī, a contemporary of the 10th and 11th Imam of the 12ers, Ali al-Hadi, born in 254, and al-Hasan al-Askari, date 260. Probably a native of the city of Qum and the secretary at the court of the Tahirids. He lived in the 3rd century and seems to have written his work toward the end of the first half of this century. This book seems to be the oldest monography on the delicate question of the falsification of the Uthmanic Codex, and it is why, after the attempted rapprochement with the Sunni positions by the Imam doctors of the Buwayhid period, the book was considered as heterodox and labeled as extremist. Nevertheless, representing the powerful pre-Buwayhid Shia movement and belonging to a large movement encompassing all kinds of tendencies protesting against the imposition of the official version of the Quran, it has not ceased to be quoted by some of the highest 12 religious authorities, from Ibn al-Juham to An-Nur al-Tabrisi. The Kitāb al-Qirā'āt is a compendium of 725 Shia hadiths, most of which going back to the 6th Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. A great number of traditions deal with the question of the falsification of the official codex and present reading variation, one of the meaning of the word Qirā'āt, that are quite considerable in relation to it. According to these traditions, only the Quranic text of Ali reported the real text of the divine revelations made to Muhammad. The work contains quotations from that version. A considerable number of quotes mention, either explicitly or indirectly, not only the saintly figures of Shi'ism, but also their enemies. That is, the members of the family of the Prophet, namely Muhammad, Ali, the most frequently quoted of all, Fatima, Al-Hassan, Al-Hussein, and the Imams among their descendants, on the one hand, and the 3 first caliphs, Aisha, Hafsa, or the Umayyads on the other. Al-Sayyāri's collection belongs to a vast theological political movement according to which one of the most immediate consequences of the usurpation of power by the enemies of the Ahlul Bayt being the falsification of the real Quran. It could not have been otherwise as the letter contained, either explicitly or by sufficiently clear allusions, the names of the family of the Prophet and its enemies now in power. These were hence forced to remove these incriminating passages and to alter others in order to hide their misdeeds and to justify their actions. Thus, from the 2nd century onward and during the 3rd century, many works dedicated to this subject were compiled in Alid circles. Indeed, a great number of hadith compilations bear titles in which the terms revelation, tanzil, falsification, tahrif, alteration, taghyir, modification, tabdil, etc. are associated. Let us, for example, mention al-Tahrif wa-Tabdil by Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Sayrafi, the Kitāb al-Tanzil wa-Taghyir written by one of the master of al-Sayyārī, namely Muhammad ibn Khalid al-Barqi, the Kitāb al-Tanzil min al-Qur'an wa-Tahrif of Abu al-Hasan Ali ibn al-Hasan ibn Faddal al-Kufi, who lived in the first half of the 3rd century, or also the Tabdil wa-Tahrif of Abu al-Qasim Ali ibn Ahmad al-Kufi, 3rd century. All these works, contrarily to the al-Sayyārī, seems to be lost. Considering the official version of the Quran as being modified and falsified is far from being limited to the Alids, who little by little came to be known as the Shia. Personalities who are highly respected by the Sunnis shared, with some variations, the same opinions, and these are reported in certain Sunni sources. Let us just mention the examples of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, according to whom the first and the 2 last surah of the Quran, namely Al-Fatiha and the Mu'awwidhatan, were not part of the Quran and were prayers recited by the Prophet. Or also the 2 short surah, Al-Khalq, Surah Al-Khalq and Surah Al-Haft, that were part of Ubay ibn Ka'b's codex and were in the end not included in the official codex. For all these reasons, the official codex, probably established at the end of the 1st century of the Hijrah, 7th century, under the Caliphate of Abdul Malik, seems to have taken many centuries in order to be imposed to all Muslims. 2.3. The tafsir of al-Hibari. As we have just seen, in the eyes of the Shia, the falsification of the Quran stemmed directly from the tragic events that followed the death of the Prophet. The violent removal of Ali, the only legitimate successor to the Prophet, the seizing of power through a large conspiracy by Abu Bakr, his companion Umar, and other Qurayshi enemies of the people of the Prophet's family. After having betrayed Muhammad and his wishes regarding his succession, it was necessary to falsify the Quran, especially if it contained the names of his real faithful followers and his real enemies. According to the first Shia Quranic commentaries, the main censored element of the Quran were above all personal names, notably those of the members of the family of the Prophet and their enemies. For the advocates of the falsification thesis, this amputation of the scripture rendered unintelligible. What can one understand of a text specially revealed about this or other person if one removes their names? It is presumably from the period of authors like al-Sayyārī, namely the 3rd century of Hijrah, or maybe even earlier, that the Shia doctrinal couple according to which the Quran is surely a guide, but a mute, silent guide, and parallel to it, the Imam is a Quran, a speaking book. Because of its falsification, the Book of God has become a silent guide, Quran or book, Imam or Quran or Kitāb Sulaym. In order to find its voice again, it now needs the teachings of the real initiates, the Imams, whose person and or teachings are said to be the speaking Quran, Quran Natiq. Both expressions thus respectively designate the Quran and the Hadith, the 2 scriptural sources of Islam, by introducing in it the problem of the scripture's intelligibility and hence the necessity of hermeneutics as a means of understanding. 2 traditions going back to Ja'far al-Sadiq and reported by al-Sayyārī seem to say it very clearly. If the Quran could be read as it was revealed, not even two people would have disagreed about it. And if the Quran had been left as it was revealed, we would have found our names in it as the ones of those who came before us, i.e. the saintly personalities of the former religions. According to this type of traditions, it's very falsification that rendered the book incomprehensible and has hence made necessary its hermeneutics with the aim of restoring its lost meaning. In Shi'ism, the Imam is the hermeneut par excellence, and his teachings, his hadiths, claim to be above all the explanation, tafsir, ta'bir, exegesis, tafsir, hermeneutics or spiritual interpretation, ta'wil of the book. During the early period, all these terms were more or less equivalents. It's the Imams and their teachings that give its voice to the Quran, rendered mute by its tampering. With time, this radical thesis, based on the falsification thesis, yielded to the doctrine according to which the Quran is itself, in its original version, a coded text on multiple levels that requires the hermeneutics of the Imam in order to be understood adequately. After this introduction, let us move on to our third text. The traditionist and exegete of the Quran, al-Husayn ibn al-Hakam al-Hibari, death in 286, seems to have been a native of the Iraqi city of Kufa. Despite some doubts raised by his biographers, it seems obvious that he was a Shia of the Zaydi persuasion. Nevertheless, 12ers do not hesitate to use him, which again demonstrate the porosity of doctrinal borders between the different Shia movements, especially during the early period. Two works of Hibari have reached us: al-Musnad, a compendium of 63 traditions on various subjects, and his Quranic commentary, edited at least twice. This commentary and its complement, Mustadrak, contain 100 traditions, the majority of which go back to the companion Ibn Abbas, and deals with presumed allusions and hidden meanings of the Quran regarding Ali, the members of his family, his followers and enemies. From that point of view, one can consider this work to be part of the Asbab al-Nuzul, the circumstances of revelation genre, in a Shia version that hides its identity under the authority of Ibn Abbas, a figure highly respected by non-Shia and considered to be the father of Sunni Quranic exegesis. In order to have a clear idea of the Quranic commentary of al-Hibari, let us translate some excerpts. Commentary of the Surah 2, Al-Baqarah, verse 25. Announce the good news to those who believe and do good works. Ibn Abbas, this verse is revealed regarding Ali, Hamza ibn Abdul Muttalib, Ja'far ibn Abi Talib, and Ubaydah ibn al-Haris ibn Abdul Muttalib. Commentary of Surah 2 Al-Baqarah, verse 45. Seek help through patience and prayer, since it is exacting except for the submissive. Ibn Abbas, submissive is the one who abases himself in prayer in front of God and who hastens to prayer with enthusiasm. This only concerns the Messenger of God and Ali. Commentary of Surah 2, verse 81-82. Rather, anyone who commits ill will find his mistake will hem him in. Ibn Abbas, this has been revealed about Abu Jahl. Those who believe and perform hundreds of deeds will be inhabitants of the garden, they will live in it forever. Ibn Abbas, this was specially revealed about Ali because he was the first to convert to Islam and the first after the Prophet to have performed the canonical prayer. Commentary of Surah 3, Al-Imran, verse 61. Come, let us call our children and your children, our women and your women, ourselves and yourselves together, and let us engage in an ordeal. Ibn Abbas, this verse is revealed about the person of the Messenger of God and Ali. The expression our women and your women concerns Fatima, our children and your children, that is Hassan and Hussein. It seems to me that this brief sample, with its somehow repetitive messages, is sufficient to clearly illustrate the nature and content of the Tafsir al-Hibari. Thus, the various Quranic verses are considered as codes, designating people or historical groups that are perfectly identified by personalities whose religious knowledge and Quranic science are authoritative. In this identification of hidden personalities under the letter of the Quran, Ali gets by far the lion's share. The profoundly pro-Ali character of our tafsir leaves no doubts, but everything happens as if Hibari, using the authority of personalities that cannot be accused of Shia sectarianism, notably Ibn Abbas, tried to prove his impartiality and his moderation on the one hand, and the objective reality, since it is unbiased, of Ali's sacrality, and to a lesser extent that of the other members of the people of the house on the other. Al-Hibari's moderation, however, is not limited to this. For him, exegesis reveals the spirit of the Quran, its hidden meaning, by identifying the personalities about whom the word has been revealed. Our author, however, never doubts the text of the Quran by professing the thesis of its falsification, mainly because of his Zaydism. For other currents that support this thesis, especially the tradition that will lead to Islamism, the importance of the personalities and their roles in history also constitute the gravity center of faith. These notions could hence not appear explicitly in the text of the Revelation. In a letter to his close disciple al-Mufaddal al-Ju'fi, reported by the traditionist al-Saffar al-Qummi, the sixth Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq insists heavily on the fact that real faith consists in knowledge of the personalities. إِنَّ الدِّينَ هُوَ مَعْرِفَةُ الرِّجَالِ. That the knowledge of the personalities is the religion of God, مَعْرِفَةُ الرِّجَالِ دِينُ اللَّهِ. And that these personalities are the friends of God, notably the Prophet, the Imam, and their followers on the one hand, the enemies of God, that is the enemies of the Imams and their followers on the other. The foundation of faith, therefore, consists in recognizing the allies of God and their enemies, that is, the enemies of God. Hence, the considerable importance of the literary genre one could call personalized Quranic commentaries in Shi'ism, above all in Twelver Shi'ism. According to the authors of these hadith compilations, the main falsification of the Quran carried out by the enemies of the family of the Prophet consists in the suppression of the names of the personality of the text of the revelation that thus becomes hardly intelligible. The exegetical teachings of the Imam's main task is to restore these names, to fill in the gaps caused by the censorship with the historical personalities about whom the verses were revealed. Thus, this becomes understandable again. It seems that at the time of Hibari Shia hermeneutics, seeking to reveal the hidden meaning, the batin of the Quran, comes down to reveal the precise historical personalities covered by the letter of censored Quranic letter. The personalized commentary of which al-Hibari's tafsir is one of the most ancient attestation that has reached us, no doubt illustrates the most ancient and most elementary form of exegetical esotericism, destined to become more complex as we see with the next work. 2.4. The Kitāb al-Darajāt of al-Saffar al-Qummi. In the 3rd century, during the period of intense activity by the authors of Quranic commentaries like al-Sayyārī and al-Hibari, and also Ali ibn Ibrahim al-Qummi, al-Ayyashi, Furat al-Kufi, just to mention the most famous traditions whose works have reached us today, the corpus of hadith of a different nature, of the Gnostic, mystical, and initiatory type is growing at the same time. This type of spiritual intellectual tradition was widespread to the Eastern Mediterranean since late antiquity, has known a great fortune in many schools of thought in Islam, but it seems now accepted that it has reached this religion through the different Shia movements, some of which quite ancient. Our 4th and last text, the Kitāb al-Darajāt, literally the Book of Perception of Degrees of al-Saffar al-Qummi, died 290, is no doubt for the early period the most important existing Shia source of the transmission of this type of tradition. What are the reasons of the development based on ancient traditions of this new type of sources that will mark the Shia religion so profoundly and enduringly that since then it has been characterized by them? Doctrinal development is always based on multiple and complex reasons. Those I mention here are probably the most superficial ones, but they have the advantage, it seems to me, to be in immediate relation with the issues we deal with. The existence of elements of the mystical and esoteric type seems very ancient in Shi'ism, but it is particularly from the second half of the 3rd century of Hijrah onward, and during all the following century that a considerable literature, as rich as it is diverse, of an initiatory and Gnostic nature with a strong messianic element develops. During that period, that literature reaches its peak with certain chapters of Ahmad ibn Muhammad al-Barqi's Kitāb al-Maḥāsin, and above all with the Basār al-Darajāt. The blossoming of this corpus, soon reaching considerable dimensions, could be attributed to acknowledgement of a double failure by the Shia. At the historical level, Shi'ism is in the minority, marginalized and often persecuted with extreme violence. Apart from a few exceptions, this assessment is verifiable throughout the view of the Umayyads and the Abbasid. Indeed, the Umayyad Caliph Umar ibn Abdul Aziz and the Abbasid Caliph al-Saffah al-Ma'mun or al-Muntasir showed a certain tolerance toward the Ali Shia and a relative respect toward the rights of the member of the family of the Prophet. But these openings, when they often qualify as being political, were short-lived. And apart from the 4th century that was the Shia century of Islam, one can consider that the followers of the Imams have been permanently defeated by the followers of the majoritarian Islam that ended up being called Sunni. Then, at the religious level, Shi'ism is ostracized, isolated, its doctrine neutralized by immense uninterrupted flow of Sunni traditions in the sense that in reaction to practically every Shia belief glorifying Ali, his descendants and followers, traditions praising his enemies or recuperating them for themselves for their own cause are created. It is in a way a matter of the Sunni's world enjoying the support of an often repressive political power against that of the Shia, the vanquished minority. Facing this situation, the latter seem to have decided to override direct confrontation, now deemed sterile, and to develop other doctrinal aspects parallel to the demand of the rights of the Ali and his descendants. Thus, the constitution of complex esoteric doctrines around the mysticism based on the figure of the Imam took shape. Progressively, the demand of the rights of Ali and his descendants, as well as the denunciation of their enemies, acquires a metaphysical and cosmic perspective. The followers are hence invited to reach transformative knowledge, redemptive wisdom, by overcoming the tragedy of history. In this Gnostic religion, the historical Imam is the master of secret teachings, and the spiritual cosmic Imam, the divine man, the ultimate content of these teachings. The work of al-Saffar is a perfect illustration of this evolution. Al-Shaykh Abu Ja'far Muhammad ibn al-Hasan al-Saffar al-Ghummi, who died in 290, was a client, freed slave, of the powerful Arab Ash'arite clan of the Iranian city of Qom. According to At-Tusi, he was the disciple of the 11th Imam, or the 12th of the 12ers, Al-Hasan al-Askari. According to a list established by Najashi and taken up by many posterior authors, As-Saffar had compiled 37 compendia of tradition, most of which, as the title indicates, were compendia of juridical traditions. Nevertheless, his only work that has reached us is the Kitāb Basār al-Darajāt. The complete title would, according to most manuscripts, be Kitāb Basār al-Darajāt fi Ulūm Al Muhammad wa ma khassahani Allah bihi. Approximately, the book of the perception of degrees of knowledge of the descendants of Muhammad, i.e. the Imams, and what God has exclusively reserved for them in this area, better known by the shorter title Basār al-Darajāt. This title has been used to name a good number of work in different periods. Meaningly, literally perception of degree, it seems to signify progressive comprehension of a given thing. In the case of this work, it clearly deals with the progressive comprehension of the initiatory science or knowledge, ilm, of the Imams, the one they possess, as well as the one about them. It is a voluminous compendium of 1,881 hadiths, making up a sort of monography about the various aspects of the initiatory sciences of the Imams, or what the compiler has considered to be as such. In order to have an idea of the content of the book, here are some titles chapters. The teaching of the Imam is arduous, hard to perceive. Their science is a secret wrapped in a secret. The Imams are the proof of God and his threshold, his face and his side, his eye, and the treasurers of his knowledge. What the infallibles, what the infallibles, the Prophet Fatima and the Imam, have seen and known in the pre-existential worlds of the shadow and particles. The Imams teaching the religion to the jinns. The Imams are the heirs of the sons of Adam and all the initiates of the past. They know the events of heavens and earth, those of paradise and hell, those of the past and the future until the day of resurrection. They hold the primordial books and the scriptures of the preceding prophets. They possess the secret books of Jafr, of the Jami'ah, the Mus'haf Fatima, those of the genealogies, of the rulers and of good and bad fortunes. They hold the shirt of Adam, the sea of Solomon, the ark and the tables of Moses, the written of Muhammad. The Imams know the supreme name of God. They hear the celestial voices, etc., etc. When all the imprisoned parcels of light will be freed throughout the many cycles of history. Gnosis is hidden in the esoteric meaning of Scripture, covered by its literal meaning. Hermeneutics is hence essential for an adequate intelligence of the sacred book. The absence of a direct source to the first 2 centuries of Islam renders difficult the study of the literary affiliation between the Gnostic movements and the different branches of Proto-Shi'ism and Shi'ism. Nevertheless, many studies, on which the most complete remains the already mentioned monographic work of Hans Heim, were able to show that religious movement of the Gnostic type, notably those influenced by or having remained loyal to Mani, Bagdassan, or Marcion, had remained active in Islamic lands until the 3rd and 4th centuries, sometimes converting to the new Arab religion with all their intellectual and spiritual weapons and luggage. It is interesting to note that the favorite regions of these movements were almost situated in Iraq, especially the cities of Kufa, Basra, and Hira, that is the native land of Shi'ism. From what stand out in Muslim hagiographical works, but also in the Imami and Ismaili corpus, as well as from works from so-called extremist Shia circles, books like the Kitāb al-Hafth wal-Adillah or the al-Kitāb, we can deduce that the teachings of the Gnostic type, transmitted through an initiatory way that is mostly oral, were present since the imamate of the Imams Muhammad al-Baqir and his son Ja'far al-Sadiq on the edge of the 1st and 2nd centuries. The Kitāb Basair al-Darajat seems to indicate that the written and methodical transmission of these teachings developed particularly since the 2nd half of the 3rd century. Third and final section, a new reading grid, a new frame of theorization. Let's go back to the issues we raised at the beginning. The connection between the development of the Islam scriptural sources and the unending internal wars the 1st centuries of that religion. As stated earlier, Shia sources have not been explored as they should in this field. The main reason for this ostracism is that they have been considered as being little representative and little reliable, as they come from a minority and are hence considered to be ideologically biased. A rather surprising attitude coming from scientific researchers supposed to be impartial, since it has been established in no uncertain manner, from Ignace Goldziher to Michael Cook, through pertinent studies spread throughout more than a century, how Sunni sources can also be historically not very credible, at least in their profoundly oriented explicit discourse, as they seek to establish the proofs of Sunni orthodoxy and orthopraxy. In the dialectic opposing the right religion to heterodoxy, Shia sources are at least as biased, but not more. They also present the advantage of being the voice of the vanquished minority and seen as such to be even more precious, as they often report information that has been either censored or distorted by the victors. It is hence from the comparative and simultaneous comparison of both categories of sources that a glimpse of a yet enigmatic historical reality may emerge on more than one issue. Neglecting Shia writings seems even more regrettable when one realizes that on certain fundamental issues regarding the history of early Islam and the genesis of its scriptural sources, these writings are sometimes corroborated by a great number of modern studies in the field of history and philology. Some examples: the existence of violent conflicts between the most important personalities of early Islam and their extension until the late Abbasid period. The particularly problematic development, transmission, and reception of the Quranic text. The political nature of the development of a huge part of the Hadith corpus, where each theological political party attempted to forge prophetic traditions justifying its own cause. The state censorship applied to the different religious or historiographical corpus. the tight relations between Quranic exegesis, its genesis, its development, or to the contrary, its prohibition and impoverishment with the political history of caliphate power. Finally, it is significant to notice that a certain number of data recognized as being typical Shia and dangerously subversive for orthodoxy have been transmitted by prestigious Sunni author. Omar preventing the Prophet from revealing his last will, the pressures and repressions accompanying Abu Bakr's ascension to the caliphate, the physical violence inflicted on Fatima by Omar, the trampled rise, the repression and massacre of the members of the Prophet's family by the caliphate's power, etc. The negative prejudice toward early Shia literature could also be explained by the frequent neglect of an obvious fact. The doctrinal schools of thought, institutions, theological political divides, as well as the scriptural writing of Islam, have seen the light in a context of violent and unending fratricidal conflicts. Yet the objective examination of history and the ideas of that period demands the impartial study of the sources not only from the side of the victors, but also of that of the vanquished, especially when the first have almost systematically tried to hide or alter a certain number of historical facts as major and compromising for them. For all this reason, it seems to me pertinent to concentrate my analysis on some representative Shia works of great schools of thought, while constantly situating them in the historical, intellectual, and spiritual context of the period, including, of course, non-Shia works in my analysis. Thus, the following works have been studied in their chronological order: the pseudo-epigraphical works of ibn Qays, whose earliest layers seems to go back to beginning of the 2nd century, the Kitāb al-Qirā'āt of Muhammad al-Sayyārī from the 3rd century, probably from the first half, the Tafsir al-Hibari, dating as well from the 2nd or 3rd century, probably the 2nd half. Finally, the exact contemporary of the latter, the Kitāb al-Darajāt of Safar. From the study of the history of this text and their contents emerge what one may consider to be a veritable logical sequence. I will here try to lay out that sequence as simply as possible. The Kitāb of Sulaym is most probably one of the earliest representative of the Iraqi city of Kufa's Shia tradition that will indelibly mark a certain number of the most fundamental doctrines and historical views of Shi'ism until today. Among them is the one regarding the succession to the Prophet. Immediately after the death of Muhammad, even before his burial, the protagonist of an old conspiracy, notably the powerful men of Quraysh led by Abu Bakr and Omar, seized power during the gathering of Saqifa during carefully prepared Operation Caliphate as a plot. Through ruse and violence, they removed Ali from power. The latter was nevertheless the sole legitimate successor to the Prophet, as he was declared as such by him in many of his declarations and even by God in the Quran. Among the immediate consequences of this plot, there was the death of Fatima, the daughter of the Prophet, following injuries caused by the violent attacks committed by Umar. Other consequences further in time, less immediate but none at least dramatic, will be the following: the assassination of Ali, rise to power of the Umayyads, 4 centuries enemies of Muhammad and his family, the possibly poisoning of al-Hassan, the latter's grandson and son of Ali, and the orders of the Umayyad Muawiyah, the assassination of al-Hassan brothers al-Hussein, particularly loved by the Prophet and almost all his family at Karbala, and the orders of Yazid, son of Muawiyah. Hence, the Shia doctrine according to which the massacre of Karbala extend its roots in the plot of Saqifa. 2. In order to justify this violent abuses, the Caliphate power set up a complex system of propaganda, censorship, and historical falsification. It first of all altered the Quranic text and forged an entire corpus of traditions falsely attributed to the Prophet by using the services of men of letters, judges, jurists, preachers, historians, etc. All of this in the midst of the ferocious as well as methodical policy of repression against opponents in general and Alids in particular. A great number of non-Shia sources more or less discreetly recount these facts. A plethora of modern studies on these issues often confirm themselves. Thus, according to this historical view of Shi'ism, official majoritarian Islam, the religion of power and its institutions have been set up by the enemies of Muhammad, his family and descendants, the sole legitimate guides of the community of believers. It is hence not Muhammad's religion, but in fact a veritable anti-Islam imposed by tyranny and deceit. 3. Contrary to the Quran known to all, the Quran revealed to Muhammad explicitly mentioned the names of Ali and his descendants on the one hand, and the enemies of Muhammad on the other, mentioned by name, notably the first two caliphs and certain powerful men among the Umayyads and their ancestors. Then, hijacking power, the opponents of Muhammad saw themselves forced to massively intervene in the Quranic text in order to alter the passages that compromised them. Assisted by powerful statesmen and professional men of letters, sometimes both qualities were united in a single individual, as was the case of Ubaydullah ibn Ziyad or Hajjaj ibn Yusuf. They developed the known official Quran that, after many interventions of all kinds, ended up with the incoherent and hardly understandable aspect we know today. The book of Revelation and Falsification of al-Sayyārī, probably the earliest monography dedicated to this subject to have reached us today, is part of a strong tradition of the first 3 or 4 centuries of Islam, according to which the official Quran, known as the Osmanic Vulgate, for a short moment. But the merciless realities of power resurfaced, and, apart from some rare and short periods of calm, the same cycle started all over again. The new caliphs and their ideologues realized soon that the religious institutions and fundamental doctrines established by their predecessor could not be modified without dangerously shaking the foundations of the empire. The idealization of the prophetic period, the canonization of Muhammad's companion, the recognition of the official Quran, and almost the totality of the Hadith corpus, already recognized by the doctors of the past, except for explicitly pro-Umayyad traditions, were not questioned. Also, on the doctrinal level, the people of Ali were now marginalized, isolated, victims of radical ostracism. The declarations of legitimacy of Ali and his descendants due to their sanctity, as well as the denunciation of their enemies, were now neutralized, flooded under a massive, rushing, and uninterrupted flow of traditions gathered in corpuses of hadith and Quranic commentaries, praising the virtues of these opponents, now sanctified. Ali was himself recuperated in thousands of ways, and in that propaganda war, the Alis were presented as fanatics, lunatics, and malcontents who didn't even recognize the first Imam, nor the other Imam of his line. The voice of the vanquished minority found itself faced with that of the victorious majority. The result seemed obvious. In these conditions, Shia discourse seemed to have felt the need to transcend those dead ends by elevating to a metaphysical level the proclamation of legitimacy of Ali and his descendants and the denunciation of their opponents. The resources of other monotheistic cultures, of course, adapted to Shia doctrines, were called upon, especially in the field of hermeneutics. This opening seems to go well beyond the probable general influence of the Christian doctrine of the 4 meanings of scriptures: literal, allegorical, moral, and anagogical, itself extending the 4 interpretive methods of Judaism: Peshat, literal exegesis; Remez, implicit hidden meaning; Derash, homiletic perception; Sod, mystical and allegorical interpretation. The sacred authority reserved for the house of David by Jews, and the sacred family of Jesus by Christians, both communities are strongly present in Islamic lands, and especially in Iraq, the native land of Shi'ism during the 1st century's Hijrah, seems to have been transmitted to the family of the Prophet household, Ahlul Bayt. Progressively, a more and more complex imamological doctrine is developed where influences from the Christian traditions and the Neoplatonic Gnostics can be felt sometimes even in detail. The cosmic guide, Imam, metaphysical archetype of the earthly God, pre-existential entity manifesting the luminous word of God, seems to find his roots among the commentators of the Gospel of John and the theologian of the Logos, such as Justine, Ignatius of Antioch, Tertullian, or Origenes. The Imam as the locus of the manifestation of God, ontological intersection between the divine and humanity, presents more than one analogy with certain Christological dogmas, from Paul to the commentary on John by Origenes, the Talia of Arius, or the doctrine of Nestorius. The heavy weight of alliance, divine friendship, walaya, in its main component, gnosis, ilm, in the sense of redeeming and transformative knowledge, transmitted esoterically by the initiator guide, the role of hermeneutics as a factor of knowledge of the hidden meaning of scriptures or the extension of the prophetic mission that the teachings of initiated constitute the most fundamental themes of Gnostic movements. One finds them massively present in al-Qasā'i Marcion by the Sanas Ummani, as in the doctrine laid out in the text of Nag Hammadi. Let us also mention the dualist vision of history of early Shi'ism and its threefold vision of humanity composed of the initiator guides, the initiated disciples, and the ignorant mass. These conceptions find their parallel in various Neoplatonistic Gnostic movements where the history of the cosmos is that of struggle between the forces of good knowledge and those of evil ignorance. Where humanity is divided between pneumatics, from pneuma, Greek spirit, the real spiritual masters whose inner divine parcel is in action, the psychics, from psyche, soul, the followers whose divine spark is only in potential, and then the helix, from hele, flesh, the ordinary men who only follow their lower instincts. Expanding more and more notably through the corpus of exegetical hadith, metaphysics and mystical gnosis also come to wrap history in order to surpass it. Hadith compilations like the Basar al-Darajat of al-Saffar al-Qummi have been major factors of this turning point which reached its peaks on the edge of the 3rd and 4th centuries. Doctrinal writings such as Idah al-Fadl of al-Fadl ibn Shazan and the Kitāb al-Muhassan of Balqi, the Quranic commentaries of Furat al-Kufi or the Kafi of al-Kulayni are other decisive examples. The sequence of the Shia perception of things schematism to the extreme would hence be the following. After the death of the Prophet, his opponents removed Ali, his sole legitimate successor, and seized power. They perfidiously designed an anti-Muhammadan religion supported by a falsified version of the Quran they presented as being the official Islam. Persecuted the Shia Imams, or the hadith attributed to them, attempt through a hermeneutical work to save the real religion of Muhammad by initiating a minority of followers to the real content of the Quranic revelation, confronted with the violent reaction of their powerful opponents. The guides introduce a metaphysical dimension in their claims by developing a religion of the Imams greatly colored by Gnosis and Neoplatonism. This interior spirituality is no doubt one of the consequences of the crushing defeat of Shi'ism on the historical level, always in the minority and persecuted in Islam. It shall also be marginalized within Shi'ism itself, with the coming to power of the Imam Jewish theologians of the Buwayhid period, who, in order to get colder to the majority Sunnis, will turn down, sometimes even considerably, a great number of their own doctrines. It is the beginning of a certain political instrumentalization of the religion, the extensions of which reach our times. On the other hand, a certain victory of the spirituality is to be looked for elsewhere. It seems to have abundantly nourished mysticism, even of the Sunni rebellions, which in turn quickly became a living source of hermeneutical thought and a spiritual dynamism. But this is a different story altogether. Merci. Thank you.
Now it is time for the question and answer session. We'll take 4 questions at a time.
D'abord, la thèse de la falsification n'est pas ma thèse.
First of all, the falsification thesis is not the professor's own thesis.
It's not my thesis, you know. This is the thesis of the traditions of the Shia. Et les traditions concernant la falsification sont devenues minoritaires et isolées à partir de l'époque bouïde.
The traditions about the tahrif have become in the minority during the Bouïd period.
Since the Bouïd period.
Since the Bouïd, yes.
Mais avant la période bouïde, la totalité des auteurs chiites parlent de la falsification.
Before the Bouïd period, the majority of the Shia authors mention the notion of falsification.
Alors, par exemple, le texte d'Al-Barqi, de Fazl ben Shazan, de Sayyārī, qui est la monographie, qui contient 700 et quelques traditions, et le Usul min al-Kafi d'Al-Kulayni, n'est-ce pas? Ce sont des textes importants qui parlent de la falsification de manière massive.
So these the texts that the professor just mentioned massively mention the issue tahrif, and in some texts we have 700 hadith mentioning the falsification.
Alors, la thèse de la falsification devient problématique à partir de l'époque bouyide. Jusque-là, même les non-chiites, beaucoup de non-chiites, défendaient la thèse de la falsification.
So up until the Buyid period, the thesis of falsification was actually quite popular amongst the Shia and even non-Shia authors. It is only after the Buyid period that the thesis of falsification was actually watered down or came to be a minority opinion.
Nous avons par exemple des thèses historiographiques, n'est-ce pas, chez Ibn Asir, par exemple, ou chez d'autres, qui parlent d'un procès, trial, qui a eu lieu à Bagdad au IVe siècle, contre les gens qui lisaient le codex de Ubay ibn Ka'b, qui n'est pas chiite.
We have references to a trial that was carried out against people who were reading the codex of Ubay
ibn Ka'b. Donc, si vous voulez, c'est-à-dire il faut historiciser les choses, n'est-ce pas? La thèse de Tahrif a une histoire, n'est-ce pas, qui est liée à l'élaboration de l'orthodoxie. Lorsque l'orthodoxie sunnite devient quelque chose de fort, donc on est obligé, n'est-ce pas, les gens sont obligés d'abandonner la thèse de Tahrif.
So you have to put the thesis of falsification of Tahrif within its historical context. As soon as basically Sunni orthodoxy crystallizes itself and becomes the authority, the thesis of falsification just basically vanishes away from the scene.
Donc juste pour finir, par exemple Khomeini, qui est quand même une des autorités, n'est-ce pas, une des plus grandes autorités de hadith chiite, a tout un chapitre sur les citations du Coran de Ali qu'on ne trouve pas dans le Coran officiel.
Yeah, I mean, Khomeini has a whole section on Tahrif where the Quran of Ali is explicitly mentioned on numerous occasions. And Khomeini is one of the most important early Shi'i authors.
And you don't find these citations in the official Quran, you know. Vous savez, ce que je dis, c'est de l'histoire. C'est-à-dire des gens comme Barqi, comme Sayyārī, comme Fadl ibn Shazan, historiquement, sont des gens qui ont vécu avant la période bouyide.
Yeah, the authors that the professor just mentioned are people who lived before the Buyid period.
Alors, donc, et ces gens-là parlent de la falsification. Maintenant, si vous dites qu'ils exagèrent, bon, vous êtes bien sûr, je suis. Mais c'est à partir de l'époque, ce que vous dites là, c'est-à-dire que le tahrif concerne l'ordre des versets. Le texte de cette théorie se trouve chez Cheikh al-Mufid. C'est le Cheikh al-Mufid, n'est-ce pas, qui parle parce qu'il essaye de justifier la thèse de la falsification. Il dit, mes prédécesseurs ont parlé de la falsification. Qu'est-ce qu'il voulait dire par là? En même temps, c'est un haut fonctionnaire de l'État abbasside, n'est-ce pas? Et donc, il veut justifier ce que disent ses ancêtres, mais en même temps, il ne peut pas soutenir la thèse de la falsification. Donc, il dit, la falsification ne concerne que l'ordre des versets ou bien les tafsirs de Ali qui ont été censurés.
Yeah. So the idea you presented that the tahrif only concerned the order of the surahs or the commentary of the Quran actually is first mentioned by Sheikh al-Mufid, and it is explained by the fact that he, on the one hand, he has to justify the mention of tahrif amongst the writings of his predecessors, but at the same time, him being a dignitary of the Abbasid state needs to be able to conciliate that, conciliate the claim of tahrif with his present political situation.
Je veux dire, dans la chronologie des textes,
So in the chronology of the text, you seem to get the impression that there is an influence coming from Gnostic Christian movements.
Mais en même temps, une doctrine n'est pas seulement des textes.
So at the same time, a doctrine is not just made of texts.
J'ai écrit un article sur l'expression Din Ali.
The professor has written an article about the expression Din Ali.
Din Ali. Et là, vivant, Ali a un statut très particulier.
So in the article, the professor shows that the prophet already in his lifetime had mentioned Ali's special status and that esoteric dimension already.
Donc c'est difficile, mais en même temps, vous savez, même au temps du prophète, les influences judéo-chrétiennes, gnostiques sont présentes, n'est-ce pas?
So even at the time of the prophet, there are very obvious Judeo-Christian influences around that explain.
Alors, quand je parle d'influence, il ne faut pas croire que ces gens-là allaient prendre un livre dans leur bibliothèque et lisaient les choses et disaient oui, j'aime bien cela, n'est-ce pas? Et ce n'est pas comme ça.
So when the professor talks about influences, it's not like these people had these books in their libraries and read them and said, well, I really like this.
Non, c'est que par exemple, la figure du Christ est connue, n'est-ce pas, au temps de Mohammed. Et on peut très bien dire telle ou telle personne a des attributs christiques.
Mm-hmm. So the figure of Christ was known during the time of the prophet, and so it's not difficult to understand that, for example, that you would say about a person that this person has the characteristics of Christ.
Or Messiah, or al-Hilālī, or something like that. C'est-à-dire que l'Arabie, vous savez, quand on dit la jahiliya, tout ça, ce n'est pas vrai. N'est-ce pas? C'est de la littérature apologétique musulmane. Les Arabes de l'Arabie sont très au courant des religions qui existent déjà, n'est-ce pas? Et surtout, après les conquêtes en Irak, n'est-ce pas, qui devient le centre de gravité de l'islam, toutes ces religions sont très présentes. Et beaucoup de ces gens-là se convertissent à l'islam.
So, contrarily to what apologetic Islamic literature says about the so-called Jahiliyyah period, the Arabs, the pre-Islamic Arabs, were very far from being ignorant about religious movements that existed around the time. And especially after the expansion of the Islamic Empire, a lot of people who belonged to these different religions converted to Islam and brought with them their theoretical and theological baggage.
Especially in Iraq.
Especially in Iraq.
It was the very center of the Islamic culture. Qu'une telle chose n'est pas islamique.
An historian cannot say this thing is not Islamic. Yeah.
Deus Revelatus, vous savez, vous avez la notion de tajalli, n'est-ce pas? Majla. Un imam est un majla, n'est-ce pas? Un mazhar. Qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? C'est-à-dire le lieu de révélation de Dieu, n'est-ce pas? Donc, c'est ça le Deus Revelatus, n'est-ce pas? C'est-à-dire Dieu se manifeste, n'est-ce pas, dans telle ou telle figure, n'est-ce pas? Vous avez dans le chiisme la notion de Nasout et de Lahout, n'est-ce pas? Alors, bon, vous pouvez très bien dire que ce n'est pas islamique, mais tout ça c'est l'islam. N'est-ce pas? C'est-à-dire que de dire ce n'est pas islamique, c'est une opinion idéologique, n'est-ce pas? Tout ça, c'est l'islam. Alors, le chiisme est une religion de la révélation de Dieu, n'est-ce pas, dans des lieux de manifestation. On ne dit pas que l'imam est Dieu, c'est différent. L'imam est le lieu de manifestation de Dieu, n'est-ce pas? C'est toute la polémique, par exemple, de littérature de polémique entre les chiites et les chrétiens, c'est ça. La différence entre l'incarnation et la manifestation.
So, the notion of the imam being the mazhar of God what does it mean? What does it represent? And it clearly, represents the idea that the divinity manifests itself in that the locus of manifestation of divinity is the Imam. It doesn't mean that the Imam in and of himself is God, but that he is the manifestation of divinity. And there is this a difference between the Christian notion of incarnation on the one hand and the Shi'a notion of manifestation. And this is something that needs to be taken into account.
Vous avez raison, vous savez, ce n'est pas seulement les chiites qui parlent des altérations dans le Coran.
So you're indeed right. It's not only the Shia who talk about alterations in the Quran.
Quelqu'un comme Suyuti, par exemple, qui était sunnite, n'est-ce pas, qui est un grand spécialiste de sciences coraniques, dans plusieurs de ses ouvrages, a des chapitres entiers, n'est-ce pas, sur les différences majeures de versions dans le Coran. Suyuti, par exemple.
Well, Suyuti, for example, in many of his chapters, has whole references to alterations in the Quran.
C'est-à-dire, il parle, si vous voulez, des différentes mushaf, n'est-ce pas, de différents mushaf, de Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, de Ubay ibn Ka'b, de l'Ash'ari, de Ali, etc. Et il rapporte leurs divergences.
Yeah. He mentions different mushaf, for example, and he actually explicitly mentions the differences between these different versions of the Quran.
Alors, avant Suyuti, vous avez par exemple Ibn Abu Daoud al-Sijistani, l'auteur de Kitāb al-Masāḥif. Ibn Abu Daoud al-Sijistani, Kitāb al-Masāḥif, c'est un auteur du IVe siècle.
Sijistani is an author from the 4th century, and he basically wrote before Suyuti, and we have
le Kitāb al-Masāḥif, c'est-à-dire le livre de différentes recensions coraniques.
Yeah. He wrote the Kitāb al-Masāḥif, which is the book about the different versions of the Quran.
Alors, lui, il parle aussi de ces différentes. Alors, c'est que vous dites là, effectivement, c'est à cause des problèmes que vous soulevez, c'est-à-dire, si on voulait soutenir la thèse de Tahrif, on ne pouvait plus utiliser le Coran. Et donc, c'est par la force des choses qu'on a abandonné cette thèse-là.
Your argument was brought about as a necessity in order to basically, that was brought about by the very doctrine of Tahrif, meaning that if the Quran can't be used anymore, then there's no purpose in it, really.
C'est pour ça, c'est-à-dire une des raisons, c'est ça. Dans le texte, on parle de ça, n'est-ce pas? C'est-à-dire pour garder le code, c'est garder l'unité de la communauté.
The code in the text really is to keep the unity of the community, and one of the necessary elements for this is precisely the integrity of the Quran.
Mais d'un autre côté, pour l'historien, vous savez, quand on dit que tout l'islam est fondé sur le Coran, c'est très théorique.
For a historian, when we claim that the whole of the Islam is basically based on the Quran, that is very theoretical.
Si vous prenez le fiqh, n'est-ce pas, si vous prenez le droit, dans le droit, il y a les livres de droit sont immenses, n'est-ce pas? Et si vous prenez la part des choses qui sont fondées dans le Coran, n'est-ce pas, c'est peut-être 1/100 des livres de fiqh.
If you take the totality of fiqh literature, there's probably just 1% of it that actually is based on the Quran itself.
Pour la simple raison que dans le Coran, les choses juridiques sont extrêmement rares.
For the very simple reason that in the Quran itself, the matters of jurisprudence and the legal matters are actually quite rare.
Ils sont très rares. Donc, si vous voulez, ce sont des choses théoriques, ce sont des choses apologétiques. Alors, c'est peut-être pour cela que dans le chiisme, où il y a la thèse de Tahrif, on ne le dit pas, mais implicitement, le hadith est plus important que le Coran. On ne le dit pas, mais c'est comme ça.
And that is why implicitly within Shi'ism, the hadith have started to have a bigger importance than the Quran itself, precisely because of the notion of tahrif.
Parce que justement, on dit sans le hadith, le Coran est incompréhensible.
precisely because without the hadith, the Quran is incomprehensible.